Yep, that looks like you're good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so we'll get started with that then. So first I'm going to talk about the rewards of urban gardens. So why is it rewarding to garden in urban environments? The first is health. So some of you listeners might have heard of the theory of nature deficit disorder. This is a term, it was coined in the early 2000s, and what it describes is the harmful effects of the separation of children and nature. So this can be especially harsh in urban environments. So studies have shown that gardening in general can have really huge positive effects on human health. So gardening in contact with nature can improve depression, anxiety, and lower stress, and it can help eliminate some of the effects of that disorder I mentioned. So the physical activity is also good for circulation and good for heart health, along with the improving just overall flexibility. If you're growing food, individuals could also have access to healthy and fresh produce, in turn having access to like healthier nutrition. The next reward is social. So community gardens can be really fun. They can be social ways to it can be a social place to interact with others. Um, Also, often as people age, there's not as many opportunities for people to find avenues for social interaction. So community gardens can be a great way to help build relationships while enjoying these other benefits. Community gardens and other green spaces are also important outdoor education spaces. So it can be really important for experiential learning opportunities, especially for youth. There's also obvious environmental benefits, so increasing green spaces in cities and other urban environments can have a huge positive effect on air and water quality and increase wildlife habitats. So these green spaces, these gardens, and even urban farms also perform ecosystem services. So they moderate temperature in cities and can help reduce stormwater runoff, improving water quality overall for the region. And there's also economic benefits too. So gardening can be a cost-effective hobby. If you're considering urban agriculture, then the money from selling produce is also important for local economies. Growing your own food can obviously save on your household expenditures, so you're spending less money on produce at the grocery store because you're getting it from your community garden or your backyard. Um, and then community gardens also result in higher property values for the surrounding area. So it's important to remember with all of these rewards that they're all connected to each other. So social benefits are good for your health, and those health benefits can also environmental benefits can also be health benefits too. So urban gardening can be a really rewarding activity in many aspects of your life and community. Next, I'm going to move on to talk about Illinois soil development and soil features. So there are five main factors when forming soil. So climate is the first one, which is the long-term weather patterns. Next is organisms. So by that I mean both micro and macroorganisms, so like bacteria, worms, and even plant life. Topography, then parent material, and finally time. So it's really important to understand soil development because it gives us information about what we should be expecting. And so it can give us information also about soil contaminants too, possibly, because some contaminants, actually occur naturally in the environment and in soils. So arsenic, for example, it's a naturally occurring element, and larger there's larger deposits of it in certain parts of the world. So in southeast Michigan, where I'm from, for example, there's more arsenic in that area. So understanding development also informs us of the history that's really influential for our soils, and especially here in Illinois over long periods of time. And the soil development has resulted in the agriculturally rich soils that we depend on so much here. Figure 1 on this slide shows the 3 major glacial advances. So these glacial advances influence the parent material that created most of the soils that we have in Illinois. So you can see that there's a chunk of southern Illinois at the bottom there and a small part of northwestern Illinois that actually were never glaciated. If you're unfamiliar, just to review, glaciers are really huge, slow-moving, basically rivers of ice. So their weight and their movement erodes land over thousands and thousands of years, and it can carry parent material from other places. So figure 2 in the middle shows the surface deposits of that parent material in Illinois. Most of Illinois is glaciated again, and it's glaciated sedimentary till. So this was deposited and eroded by glaciers, and also loess, which was deposited by wind. And then figure 3 is kind of illustrating the same point, and you can use that as reference for later. In the Midwest, topography and parent material had the biggest influences on soil formation. So in Illinois, there are over 600 kinds or series of soil, but in general, glacial deposits from these glacial advances are what determine the makeup of the parent material and therefore Illinois soils. Keep going with soil development and soil features, and we talk about categorization and soil regions. So soils are classified into orders. Taxonomy is the branch of science that's concerned with classification and naming. And I'm not going to go too deep or too long on this, but it is really important because taxonomy and classification is what helps us break down and organize really large chunks of information. So it helps us create patterns, and it helps us have a common language so we can communicate about what's happening. So the first figure shows that most of Illinois is comprised of mollisols or prairie or grassland soils, so that's that dark blue color. These soil orders are really broad, and more detailed information about the soils that you have in your area can actually be found using this tool called the Web Soil Survey. So it's operated by the USDA NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and they have a large database where you can look up your area and the soils. And then the second image here is for your reference. So even though there are over 600 kinds of soil in Illinois, like I mentioned, they can be generalized into the 8 regions that are on this map, and these have been identified based on the age and based on parent material too. So if you're interested in more details about soil formation, I recommend viewing Ryan Pankaw's presentation. So he did a 4 Seasons webinar. He's a horticulture educator also, and it was called Tree Care in Urban Soils, and that's also found on the Extension 4 Seasons Gardening YouTube page. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit and talk about Cook County, Illinois, which is where my office is located. So in 2011, field work was completed for the Cook County Soil Survey, and it was done in partnership between the USDA, the NRCS, and the Illinois Agricultural Experimental Station. Scientists at this time identified over 50 soil series, and the soil survey is really important because it gives us clues and clues to characteristics like texture, structure, and chemistry, which can help us sort of guess how soil will react and what is happening in the environment. So with this information, we have this information, but we also know that urbanization has affected our land use, and therefore that's also affected our soil properties too. So this is related to us talking about urban soils because it's important to know the context and sort of what we're starting with. So we can ask the questions of, are they same? Are they the same? What about them is different, and how will they react? So with urban soils, I like to say that variation is a key characteristic of urban soils. So soils in urban areas can share properties with soils in forests and pastures and fields, but there's also really large differences in these naturally occurring soils and when an area is converted to an urban area. So on the left side, you can see a soil profile of a natural mollisol. So like if you dug a big hole and you were standing in the hole looking at the soil profile, this is what you would see. So mollisols have deep and really high organic matter content. These are soils that are found in grasslands and prairies, like I mentioned before, which historically is about 70% of all Illinois soils. On the right, there's a soil profile of an urban anthropogenic soil. So anthropogenic just means human influenced, and this soil is really variable, and it also includes a backfill of construction and other waste material. So urban soils, in urban soils, the main soil properties are actually derived from human activities. So urban environments, may have natural soils under layers of fill, but urban soil classification is a new and growing field in soil science. So scientists are still sort of working on that common language that I was talking about before. So anthropogenic soils, and specifically urban soils, they're influenced, modified, and created by human activity, and they're formed in a few key ways. So they're formed through either sealing a natural soil under pavement, transforming a soil by human action like digging, or just the development of a whole new soil profile where parent materials can be moved or deposited by human action, like adding backfill or adding grading materials. So what makes them different? Adding layers on top of natural soils really affects soil properties. So adding that layer can interrupt gas exchange. It also changes drainage patterns. Compaction is a big thing too. So compaction from heavy traffic and disturbance reduces pore space, and so it reduces spaces where soil oxygen is, and that can also limit root growth and development of plants. So moving soil by grading, clearing, excavating, or removing topsoil is a really major human action. And then also the inclusion of foreign materials. So like buried waste materials or chemical spills, or sort of like what you saw in the last slide with that last picture. So these actions and these materials that are present also are really variable depending on the past land use or management. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in urban soils, and that's why I'm saying that, variability is the only thing that you can really count on. So most of you are probably listening to this presentation to hear about some of these problems and risks. So contamination potential can be really high in urban soils, especially depending on industry and land use, for example. So this figure is from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. So they made this soil safety resource guide, and it was really helpful while making this presentation and could be a really good resource for urban growers out there. So the figure that is on this slide outlines the important contaminants and their potential sources. So contaminants can be released into the environment by human activities like burning coal, and urban soils, since they're often closer to these pollution sources, can have higher concentrations of contaminants. So because of industrial manufacturing or busy roads, also dumps and demolition sites. So the three contaminants that are of particular concern are lead, arsenic, and cadmium. So those first three. And that's because of their frequency, their toxicity, and the potential, therefore, for human exposure. And by looking at this chart, you can see that the sources include, burning coal, also pesticides, batteries, gasoline, treated lumber. So there can be many potential sources. Urban gardeners in general are mostly familiar with lead, but there are also other contaminants besides heavy metals. So organic chemicals like fuels and oils. There's also solvents and, biohazards and bacteria and such that people should also be aware of. With all of this, why do we care? We care about urban soil contamination because of the potential human health risks. Okay, we know that lead is harmful to children and developing brains. We know that arsenic and asbestos poisoning can cause increased risk of cancer. So it's really important that we're informed. Our health really depends on it and the health of our children and our communities. So although there's this possibility of really serious health concerns, exposure or risk does not automatically mean harm. So just because something is there doesn't mean you have been exposed or you have been poisoned. It's important to remember that risk is going to exist no matter what. So you can never get rid of risk altogether, but with proper management and precautions, you can greatly reduce your risk when dealing with soil contaminants, which is what I'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. So there are three main exposure pathways for contaminants. So that's ingestion, inhalation, and skin contact. So people can be exposed to these contaminants by either accidentally ingesting soil or inhaling contaminated dust or soil particles or through direct skin contact. So soil ingestion in particular is a major concern with kids. So because of their behaviors, they might ingest larger quantities of soil than adults. They put their hands in their mouths, for example, more often than adults do. And they're also much more sensitive to the effects of contaminants. People who eat produce grown in contaminated soils can also ingest soil particles on the surfaces of plants. So like peeling root vegetables or removing outer layers of leaves and washing produce can actually go a really long way in reducing surface contaminants. Because concentrations that are in the soil are much higher than what might have possibly been uptaken into the plant. So crops, if they're grown in really highly contaminated soils, can actually accumulate contaminants inside of their tissues, but it varies greatly with the type of crop and other soil conditions to measure that amount that's going in. So because contaminants in general tend to accumulate in root tissues, it's more of a concern for root vegetables. So we are starting with this environmental pollution. This environmental pollution is what's affecting our soil, it affects our water and our air, and that can lead to potential exposure through sediment, through, inhalation of dust, or through the actual food having contaminants. So knowing the land use history of your site can give you really major clues to possible contamination. Knowing the past use can really go a long way in giving you information about these possible contaminants. So for example, in urban environments, maybe you're interested in gardening in a vacant lot, but that vacant lot could be the site of a former gas station that might have a leaky underground storage tank, or the site of a former dry cleaner where they didn't dispose of their solvents and cleaning material correctly, and they just, threw it in the backyard. So learning your land use history, either from firsthand knowledge, so you live there, you've seen the businesses come and go, or through talking to your neighbors, is a really, really important and great first step. But you should always check with state or federal agencies if possible, so always check other resources too. It also might be helpful to know about land use history of surrounding properties. So especially if those surrounding properties are commercial or they're industrial, because the proximity of prior spills or leaks or, in general pollution can affect the soil safety of the site that you're looking at gardening on also. You can also get a lot of information by figuring out who owns the land that you want to garden on. So you can contact your local county tax assessor to find out who's paid taxes on a property, for example. And you can consult public records like deeds, or you can look at a city-owned land inventory. So in Chicago, there's a department, the Department of Planning and Development, and they oversee the city's land use policies, and they also operate a city-owned land use inventory where you can look up information about city lots. So some vacant lots might be owned by private companies, organizations, or individuals, but it's also possible that they're city-owned lots, and the city should have that information available. And so the department will be different depending on your locality, but that's what the Department of Planning and Development is, who oversees that in Chicago. So after you've learned about your land use history, you can use that information to make guesses about what contaminants are likely present. So based on that chart that I showed you in a previous slide, you can always sort of make inferences, but again, it's always better to get information from a government agency or to get actual data about that information. But the Illinois EPA has some helpful information. So they have a database of leaking underground storage units from former gasoline stations. So you can look up your address or the address of the site that you want to garden on, possibly on that website. And then the Illinois DEQ, which is the Department of Environmental Quality, also has documents. You can also file a Freedom of Information Act request to receive that information on your site too. So I do want to continue to stress that, what is present doesn't always mean it's available for plant uptake. So growers are often really concerned about what ends up in their produce, what ends up being uptaken into plants, which is really important. But as I mentioned before, ingesting and inhaling actual contaminated soil is often a bigger risk. So this whole process that I've outlined of, interviewing neighbors and inspecting the site, consulting documents, is basically what constitutes a phase 1 site assessment. So doing it personally is not official. So it's only an official phase 1 site assessment if it's done by a trained environmental professional. It is also possible that your local or state environmental agency might be able to help provide this assessment for you, or they might be able to connect you with professionals who could do the phase 1 site assessment in your area. So the EPA also has a cleanups in my community map. So this is where they have information about brownfields and other contaminated properties that are a federal concern. This won't have all the information about local areas, but it is a good site to sort of reference and look up your area in to see what industries might have been around you or if there's any cleanup sites in your community. So after you do that, you also want to test your soil. So this is another tool that's recommended for testing for contaminants. So usually the process involves requesting a test kit and collecting soil samples and then mailing the samples in for analysis. Cost varies. Often contaminant and heavy metal testing is an added fee, so you do want to make sure you pay attention to that with your soil test and the company that you're using. So also, since there can be a lot of variations across a garden, there can be variations in contamination. You want to make sure that you're collecting samples from many locations, so not just from one. So for example, if the site you're interested in growing in is a vacant lot that's kind of close to a highway, you know, because of the historic use of lead in gasoline, lead contamination is likely going to be higher closer to the road than it is further. So you'll want to do testing sort of across the whole area. And always follow the specific instructions from the soil testing laboratory. The University of Illinois Extension does have a website that lists some of the soil testing laboratories in the area. It also indicates if they test for some of these heavy metals. So you can, you know, reference Extension to find, you know, a soil testing lab to go to. But it's important to remember that soil testing labs often only test for common contaminants, so like lead or arsenic. So if you get your soil test back and it's low for lead, for example, that doesn't mean that that contaminants aren't present, because you won't get information about something that you didn't ask to be tested. So it's important to use this soil test along with your site history, and that is what will give you sort of the best and most well-rounded picture of what's going on at your site. So along with this soil test, you might also consider getting your water tested. So depending on your water source, there could also be a potential risk of contamination. So you did your site history and you did your soil test, and now you need to interpret the results. Unfortunately, interpreting the results of a soil test can be really difficult, and mostly that's because there's not really one standard for safe levels of contaminants for food production in urban environments. So there are standards and threshold levels for contaminated site cleanup, but that doesn't necessarily give us information about bioavailability of contaminants for plant uptake. So standards can vary greatly by state, federal, and even international standards too. We do have information to go off of though. So scientists have concluded, for example, that you know, we know that there's no safe level of lead exposure, and best management practices should be implemented whenever lead is present, for example. So there is more information about heavy metals than there is about some of those other contaminants that I had talked about, just because lead has also been researched for much longer too. So for lead, 400 ppm or parts per million is considered low, and best management practices that I'm going to talk about in a few slides are what should be implemented. There is also a medium and a high level for lead, so 400 to 1200 parts per million is considered medium, and that is only suitable for growing crops where the fruit is harvested, so along with the best management practices that I'm going to talk about, and covering soil also to minimize inhalation of soil particles. And then 1200 ppm or more is very high, and so that soil should be covered, and you should contact the proper governmental agency to help with exposure reduction methods, so they'll give you more information about that. But the concentrations also on this slide for cadmium and chromium are used to guide cleanup efforts of soil, so 70 ppm for cadmium and 230 ppm for chromium. And these don't give us much of an indication of what's safe for agricultural use, but it at least can be a starting place and can give us a guide for possibly using best management practices for soil exposure, definitely. And then the unrestricted use level of water, so with that inorganic arsenic that's there, is the 0.39 parts per million. And so that's a water limit, but states are sort of starting to take into account these background levels of arsenic in soils. So I'm sure we'll be seeing more information from the EPA about arsenic in soils in the future. So with all of this, it does depend on the amount that's present, the form of the contaminant that's there, so the chemical form, and the site use, so what you're planning on doing in that place. There are sites and areas of special concern. So if the area you want to garden in is one of these land uses or one of these former land uses, you should pay particular attention and possibly, choose a different site depending on what you want to do there. So industrial and manufacturing sites, these are obviously concerned because of potential chemical spills that might be historically have happened in that area. Also landfills, junkyards, waste disposal sites, also because of chemical leakage and leaching. Parking lots and places near heavy vehicle traffic because of, lead and the legacy of lead. Next, household sites too, so near sidewalks and close to the house because of lead paint. And then former farmland also, so historical pesticide use could be a problem too. So next I'm going to talk about some of these best management practices that I have referred to in the slide before. So if you are concerned about soil contamination, you can follow these best management practices, which are specifically outlined for heavy metals and for lead. But again, you should always consult a professional if you suspect other contaminants like solvents or organic compounds. So those travel differently in the soil and they have different practices if you suspect them. So to minimize your direct contact with the soil, wearing gloves and washing your hands after working in soils and definitely before eating is recommended. You should also cover existing soil and walkways with mulch, landscape fabric, stone, or bricks, and this will help minimize that inhalation exposure route, minimize soil from being sort of kicked up and inhaled by people. So if the contamination is at a medium level, so this is what I was talking about before with the 400 to 1200 parts per million for lead, it's recommended to grow fruit crops rather than leafy greens and avoiding root crops. You should also not track dirt from the farm or from your garden into the house, especially if you have kids, because they could, since they're on the ground, if they're crawling around, they could ingest some of that soil that's brought into the house. And Really importantly, thoroughly washing your produce before storing or eating will go a long way. So if you don't grow root crops, or if you do, excuse me, grow root crops or leafy greens, make sure you peel the root crop and also removing the outer layer of the leafy vegetables to help get rid of the soil that might be stuck on the surface. You can also build plots away from existing roads and railways, and also building a hedge or fence might be recommended to help reduce some of the wind-blown contamination, so to help reduce soil from another area getting onto the area that you're gardening in. So research has also shown that adding soil amendments could decrease heavy metal bioavailability. So this means that it's harder for plants to uptake heavy metals. So you can use soil amendments like compost, for example, or something to raise the pH or neutralize the pH. And so research has shown that in some cases, depending on what you're growing, can make a difference, and otherwise it can also help, it also might keep the bioavailability the same, but it depends on sort of what you're growing. You can also add topsoil or clean fill from certified soil sources, so that way you know exactly what's in the soil that you're growing in, and then also building raised beds or container gardens where you can control, again, what soil your plants are growing in. So with raised beds, there are some concerns. So raised beds built in contaminated areas, they don't remediate what's contaminated in the soil underneath or in the surrounding beds. So there's still a potential of soil being kicked up by people, or, people playing around the beds. You could still inhale or accidentally ingest contaminated soil from not inside the bed, but again, these risks are higher for children. You should definitely make sure that the soil that you're filling your raised bed in is filled with clean, uncontaminated soil, that it's from a certified source, and also pay attention to the depth of your raised bed. So roots might extend into the contaminated soil below, so you want to make sure that there's either, a water permeable fabric or a larger or taller raised bed to further minimize your exposure to that underlying soil there. So the key points that I want to drive home, my key points are, knowing your site history through that phase 1 environmental site assessment. So talking to your neighbors, looking at land use history will be a really important tool to use to get clues to what contaminants might be present in your soil. You can also get a targeted soil test. So make sure that if you're worried about a certain contaminant, try and find a soil testing facility that has the capabilities of testing for that contaminant. And then where appropriate, use best management practices to minimize the risk of exposure. And so the ones that I outlined are what's recommended for lead and for, other heavy metals. I also want to make people aware of a current survey project that's happening in Chicago. So this is happening in partnership with the University of Illinois at Chicago and the Center for a Livable Future. And so they're doing a survey. They have collected soil, water, and produce samples from many urban gardens in Chicago, and they're analyzing them for the presence of heavy metals specifically. So they got their samples back in June of this year, and they're currently in the analysis phase. So if you're interested of the results of this study, please, monitor this website and keep a lookout, because I'm sure they'll be, publishing pretty soon, and it might give us, especially for Chicago growers, will give us, a lot of good information about what's going on in the produce and soil and water in Chicago. And then there's also a really exciting option now for rapid, low-cost on-site screening for lead. And so this is using portable X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, or PXRF. This is a screening that's semi-quantitative, so it does not replace getting a lead test from a certified laboratory, but it can provide, screening information that's faster and generally cheaper than getting it lab tested. And so local foods educator in Cook County, Zach Grant, and also Dr. Andrew Margineau, who's at Urbana-Champaign, have recently brought this technology to a few events in Cook County, and they're also accepting samples. So if you have questions about this technology and this project, or you're interested in possibly sending a soil sample, please contact them. Their emails are on the slide right there. So with that, thank you to the State Master Gardener Program for coordinating the Four Seasons webinar, the Four Seasons coordinators, Ryan Pankow, a horticulture educator, and Zach Grant, who helped with this presentation. This is my contact information. If you have any further questions, feel free to send me an email, and I'll do my best to try and answer those questions. And then our past recordings of the Four Seasons Gardening webinar can be found on YouTube using this website. So they have, and then this presentation will also be posted on there pretty soon. So with that, I am done. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, we have about like 10 to 15 minutes of time left, and will do my best to answer them. So you can either unmute yourself and ask, or please type your question into the chat box. So there's a question that says, do you know where the arsenic in Michigan came from? Was it from glaciers? So arsenic is just naturally occurring in earth, mineral deposits, and it dissolves. So there's higher sort of naturally occurring higher arsenic levels in groundwater in Michigan just because of those mineral deposits. So that's, kind of where it came from, and especially in, southeastern Michigan, if you're using well water, you might consider taking a look at groundwater surveys that have been done in your area. I know the Michigan DEQ will test for water and arsenic, so you can contact them directly.